Hello, my name is Alex Zvoleff, and I'm Senior Director of Resilient Science in the Moore Center for Science at Conservation International. This is the first in a series of online trainings that we'll be preparing in support of the Resilient Food Systems Project, which is a 12-country project funded by the Global Environment Facility. Conservation International is a partner in the Resilient Food Systems Project, particularly supporting that project in developing frameworks for supporting the monitoring and assessment of resilience. So the goal of this training is to help support the countries that are member projects of that broader resilient food systems work in learning how to design frameworks for monitoring and assessing resilience and in understanding some of the available data sources that they can use to assess resilience within their projects. So of course, while the intended focus of this training is those who are involved in the resilient food systems work, the topics that I'll talk about are much more broadly relevant. So whether or not you're engaged in the Resilient Food Systems Project, there should be some very useful information in here on both defining and assessing resilience. So as I mentioned, this is just the first in a series of trainings. We'll also be conducting some subsequent online trainings on both going into some more specifics on how to use some of the tools that I'll talk about here today, and then also subsequent training on how to link with some other regional platforms that support building resilience. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So first off, I'd like to define resilience. So of course, I've mentioned the term resilience several times already without defining it. So whether or not you're new to this field, I think it can be useful to step back and make sure that we define some of the terms that we're talking about. So resilience in particular is one of those terms for which you'll see many varying definitions. Even if you look at the academic literature, there are various different ways in which resilience is defined depending on the system of interest. So I just want to very briefly show you some of the definitions that I've encountered, and then also I'll introduce what I think is a useful definition in terms of the Resilient Food Systems Project. So the first that I want to show is drawing from Carl Folk in a paper from 2002. And this is if you haven't seen this paper, I definitely recommend looking at it. Very pivotal in terms of defining what we mean when we talk about resilience in a development context. So it's defined in that paper, resilience for social ecological systems is related to 1, the magnitude of shock that the system can absorb and remain within a given state. Secondly, the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization. And thirdly, the degree to which the system can build capacity for learning and adaptation. So we see a number of different concepts in here. First, of course, the concept of stressors and shocks. Secondly, the importance of self-organization. And then thirdly, the degree to which systems can build capacity for learning and adaptation. Whoops, skipping far ahead there. Another useful definition more recently is in the work from O'Connell et al. And this is in a report developed in support of the Global Environment Facility, which I'll link to at the end of my presentation. And they define resilience as the ability of a system, e.g. a farming system, to absorb disturbance and recover while retaining the same identity. Third definition I just want to share, drawing again on some of the development literature. Resilience is the capacity over time of a person, household, or other aggregate unit to avoid poverty in the face of various stressors and in the wake of myriad shocks. So we've seen a number of commonalities through this definition. So of course, needing to understand the magnitude and exposure to stressors and shocks, the capability of the systems to self-organize, and of course, then there is this aspect of recovery that we've seen in these definitions as well. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that when discussing resilience, it's important to remember to be specific. Resilience of what to what? So what exactly is it that we're talking about? What is define the system, define the stressors and shocks? This is key in our work. And of course, our definition also needs to be relevant to the project and system of interest. So what might this actually look like in the context of a project? So one example here, so say for example that you are interested in work in a coastal context and you are looking at the capacity of systems to absorb stressors and shocks from storm surge. So there you might define resilience like this. Resilient coastal infrastructure is able to absorb increased wave heights during storms due to climate change without coastal erosion. Our interest here, of course, though, is not on coastal infrastructure, it's on food security. So what might a definition look like in the context of the Resilient Food Systems program? So this is one example of what a definition of resilience in the context of an intervention aimed at building food security might look like. For example, a resilient food system is able to maintain food access, availability, and utilization in the face of acute stresses and shocks due to climate change. So you'll see here that we're very clearly defining what we mean. Resilience of what to what? We're talking about resilience of food security as measured by food access, availability, and utilization in the face of acute stresses and shocks due to climate change. So of course, stressors and shocks like climate change are not the only things that impact food security. There are many other stressors and shocks that can come into play as well and impact food security. But if the focus of your project is on climate change, then I would suggest a definition like this might make sense. Of course, as I said previously, it's important to consider how you define resilience in the context of your project. So ensure that you're capturing those stressors and shocks of relevance, as well as those aspects of the system that are relevant to your work. Once we've defined resilience, how do we actually assess it? So this is where the idea of capacities come into play. There's different capacities that are related to resilience: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities. What do I mean here? So when I talk about absorptive capacities, I'm talking about the amount of change that a system can undergo while retaining function and structure. So remember back to some of those definitions we talked about before that had to do with defining resilience in terms of the ability of a system to undergo change without changing into a new system. Go back. Okay, restart on this slide. So how do we actually assess resilience once we've defined it? There's different capacities that are related to resilience: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities. So what do I actually mean by these three capacities? So when I talk about absorptive capacity, I mean the amount of change a system can undergo while retaining function and structure. So remember earlier in the definitions that I showed, this relates back to the fact that resilience is in part related to the ability of a system to absorb stressors and shocks without transforming into a completely different state. Adaptive capacities are also important, which refer to the ability of a system to adapt, learn, and adjust. Transformative capacities as well come into play, the capacity of a system to shift to a new and different system. So when we think about a resilience monitoring framework, assessing these three different capacities in terms of the unit that we're looking at, whether it be a household, a community. Again, this is going to depend on the project itself, but assessing these three capacities is of importance. Of course, those aren't the only things that we need to consider when we're building a framework to monitor resilience. What else do we need to look at? Well, first of all, I already mentioned, of course, assets and capacities as a key component of a resilience monitoring framework. But there's also, of course, other factors that come into play. So for example, I've said a lot about the stressors and shocks to which a system might be exposed. It's important that within a framework aimed at monitoring resilience, we also have indicators related to the stressors and shocks themselves so that we can understand the magnitude, frequency, and type of stressors and shocks that the unit of analysis is exposed to. So again, the unit of analysis, when I say that, I just mean what is that? Is that an individual? Is that a household? Is that an organization? Again, this is all going to depend on the project type. At the same time, we also need to have other measures of relevant contextual factors. So these could be institutions, for example, which households might be able to obtain loans from in times of climate stress. They also relate to available natural resources. Of course, natural capital is one thing that will impact on resilience. Ecosystem function, of course, comes into play. With declining ecosystem function could, of course, potentially impact household. So assessing all three of these components is important when we consider how we define a framework to monitor resilience. I do just want to make a note here. While the focus of this training is, of course, on assessing resilience, those projects involved in the Resilient Food Systems project aren't responsible only for assessing resilience of food security, but they are also responsible for assessing changes in ecosystem services and socioeconomic benefits as well that are attributable to their project activities. So there will be some content in this training related to ecosystem services and socioeconomic benefits as well, to ensure that projects also have the information needed to assess those important two categories of indicators as well. So what do I mean by ecosystem services? Ecosystem services, of course, are the benefits that humans derive from functioning ecosystems. These could be things like hydrological and climate regulation, nutrient carbon cycling, etc. And then socioeconomic benefits are defined as the benefits of project activities to households and communities, which of course we want to have disaggregated by gender to ensure that those goals around gender mainstreaming are met as well. There is a guidance document on the material that I'm discussing here today. I'll be coming back to this at the end of the presentation as well when I discuss places where you can get additional resources. But if you see the Resilient Food Systems website at resilientfoodsystems.co, there is a resources section in which this guidance document can be obtained. So how do you actually acquire the data needed to assess the indicators within this monitoring framework? So this is a simplification, but just to give a broad overview of the various ways in which data might be acquired. What I've done in this presentation is you'll see these three icons used throughout to describe the various means of acquiring data. So the little clipboard and pencil indicates where social surveys and qualitative data collection are likely to be the most fruitful. So this, of course, is anything that could draw on individual and household surveys, on interviews, on focus groups, for example. The little satellite icon indicates those indicators in which Earth observation data might be most useful. So this can be sensors on satellites or other platforms. It could be drones. It could be airborne sensors that can be used to gather information on characteristics of the Earth's surface. So this is particularly useful in understanding land cover, productivity, those types of indicators. And then the little computer screen with the chart indicates where modeling is most useful. And so modeling I've defined as wherever you need to use a mix of data sets and statistical or computer models to assess biophysical or socioeconomic information. So this separation is somewhat artificial, but I think it's useful just to give a general idea of the range of ways in which information might be acquired in order to actually populate some of the indicators that I'll discuss about in a moment. So if we come back to those components of a monitoring framework that I talked about before, when we talk about assessing resilience of food security, all three of these means of collecting information will be useful. So surveys, Earth observation data, and also modeling. When we talk about ecosystem services, surveys are going to be less useful generally, and typically Earth observation or modeling data will be most useful. And when we talk about socioeconomic benefits, survey data is really almost always a requirement. Again, this is not always true across all of the indicators, but in general, this is a general idea of how you might assess data for the indicators. As I've mentioned before, the Resilient Food Systems Project is a 12-country project. So it's a very large project, and there's also a regional hub component as well, that is designed both to aid in sharing knowledge across the projects as well as to integrate information at the regional scale. So given this structure of the Resilient Food Systems project, and this information again could be useful for other types of projects as well, what I've done is in the tables I'm about to show, I have defined the indicators as falling within various tiers. And the reason I do this is, again, given that the Resilient Food Systems project is a 12-country project, there are some data sets that will make the most sense across all 12 countries, just given the cost of acquiring data, while other data sets really will only make sense at, say, a project scale, if it's very detailed household level information, for example. So when I talk about the indicators, a tier 1 indicator is something that could be applied at a regional level. And generally, this means that there's publicly available data available that can be used for it. So typically, tier 1 data is generally going to be the lowest cost. Tier 2 data is something that can be applied at a country level, taking advantage of detailed project level information that's being collected across a large number of projects within a country. And then tier 3 is more specialized indicators that may not be commonly collected by an individual project within a country. So typically this is, again, as I said before, the type of information you might collect. So returning to the topic at hand, soil sampling, how do we actually assess by resilience household of food security? The focus of the Resilient Food Systems project is to enhance the sustainability and resilience of food production systems. But how do we actually measure this? So as we looked at in the beginning, we can redefine resilience in the context of food security as a system with resilient food security is able to maintain food access, availability, and utilization in the face of chronic and acute stresses and shocks. And then in order to actually assess changes in resilience that we might attribute to project activities, we need to look at assets and capacities, stressors and shocks, and contextual factors. So our interest now is trying to understand what are the various indicators that we can use to assess changes in assets and capacities, stressors and shocks, and contextual factors, such that we can understand more broadly how resilience might be changing. Again, assets and capacities are related to the unit of analysis. So for example, this might be the household. Stressors and shocks capture the magnitude, frequency, and types of stressors and shocks that households are exposed to. And then indicators associated with the contextual factors are seeking to capture the institutions, natural resources, and ecosystem functions that might affect the resilience of a broad area. What are some potential sources for these indicators? Well, it's going to vary a bit depending on the component that we're talking about, be it assets and capacities, stressors and shocks, or contextual factors. But in general, social surveys and qualitative data collection, Earth observation, and modeling are all important. Tier 1 data, in terms of social surveys, can often be acquired from census and publicly available survey data. Tier 2 and 3 indicators, so again, these are the indicators that are typically more detailed, typically can only be collected through specialized surveys. So some examples that you might draw on are, for example, the Multidimensional Poverty Assessment Tool, or MPAT, Self-Evaluation and Holistic Assessment of Climate Resilience of Farmers and Pastoralists, or SHARP Plus, and then also the Diversity Assessment Tool for Agrobiodiversity and Resilience, DATAR. All three of those tools are supported by partners of the Resilient Food Systems project, and more information on them can be obtained from the Resilient Food Systems website. There are also public sources like the demographic and health surveys that may be useful depending on where a project is located. The DHS is a survey focused on developing countries that has data available across a broad number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not in all areas, and the information that's available publicly is aggregated at the regional scale, but there are very useful information contained within that survey, so it's worth looking into whether or not there is available information for your project area. It is also possible to use more detailed than regional information from the DHS, but that will require a higher level of expertise from the project team. Earth observation data can be acquired both from free tools like Trends.Earth, Collect Earth, and the Resilience Atlas, all of which are supported by partners within the Resilient Food Systems project. And of course, there are also many other sources of Earth observation data as well, Global Forest Watch is a very well-known data source for information derived from Earth observation data. And of course, it's also possible to do customized analysis from satellite imagery of your area, or drone imagery, or airborne imagery. Though again, of course, this will require either expertise within a project team or contracting an individual with that expertise. Modeling is also useful in terms of assessing resilience, and there's freely available tools like, again, trends.earth, and then also the ex-ante carbon balance tool, or EXACT, from the Food and Agricultural Organization. And there's also, of course, many specialized tools that are available for data analysis and ecosystem service modeling. I'll go into those in a second. One example I do want to highlight is the Resilience Atlas, which is supported by Conservation International, and it will actually be mentioned again in a later series of videos within this online training. But the Resilience Atlas can be a useful tool for obtaining broad-scale information on the various components of resilience that I've mentioned here today. So I do just want to show you very quickly what that might look like. How do we monitor ecosystem services? So this was the second component of the resilient food systems monitoring requirements that I mentioned earlier. Typically, ecosystem services monitoring is supported primarily by either Earth observation data or by modeling. Ecosystem services can be directly modeled using specialized tools like ARIES, Costing Nature, Invest, Waterworld. And if you see down at the bottom of this screen, there's a link to a useful report that gives an assessment of available tools for measuring, modeling, and valuing ecosystem services. So I'd suggest you see that for some more information and also a comparison of these various tools. If you don't wish to go the modeling route, which can take a bit more expertise, there is an alternative of using indicators derived from Earth observation data as proxies for ecosystem services. So here you're not going to be able to assess ecosystem services in the direct units, but you can measure something like vegetation productivity as a proxy for provisioning services, for example. So what might these indicators look like? So for example, what I just mentioned, you see here on the far left, for service type provisioning, you'll see if you're interested in, say, crop production, you might look at Earth observation data as a proxy to assess productivity of agricultural lands. And we've listed that within tiers 1, 2, and 3, because given that it can be assessed directly with Earth observation data, it's something that could be applicable across scales. I've also given some examples here of different types of regulating and cultural service as well, and the tiers within which they would fall. So this is just a partial table. Again, you'll want to see the guidelines on developing a framework for monitoring resilience of food security that I mentioned before for the full set of indicators. What about socioeconomic benefits? So as I mentioned before, we define socioeconomic benefits as those benefits of project activities that are accrued by households and communities. Of course, these should be disaggregated by gender. So at tier 1, there's the potential to use publicly available data sets based on census or large surveys carried out by international organizations. DHS, I mentioned before. LSMS, or the Living Standards Measurement Survey conducted by the World Bank, is another example. The LSMS has a particularly large amount of information on agriculture, so the LSMS surveys can be very useful in the context of assessing resilience of food security, provided, of course, that there is LSMS survey data available in your area. And then at tiers 2 and 3, the indicators for socioeconomic benefits generally need to be collected using social surveys carried out by country projects. And that's just a function of the fact that when we're trying to access information on actual, for example, household access to services, it's something that can be tough to get from publicly available information. So what are some example indicators for assessing socioeconomic benefits? Income, of course, is one. Income, I've listed as a tier 2 and 3 indicator in the table here, and that's because income typically is something that's going to be hard to get at in a useful way from broadly available data, particularly if you're trying to assess potential changes in income that might be a result of project activities. Similarly here, information from DATAR, which is a tool developed by Bioversity, which is one of the partners of the Resilient Food Systems Project, can be useful to assess crop diversity and also diversity in terms of animal breeds, which of course are important in understanding the resilience of agricultural systems. Information on membership in co-ops, farmers organizations, advisory networks. Again, useful information in terms of assessing resilience, but not something that we're going to find in tier 1 broadly available regional data. So we've listed it here as tier 2 and tier 3. So I've gone now here through a number of examples of indicators for assessing resilience of food security, socioeconomic benefits, and ecosystem services. Of course, this is a very quick presentation though. Where can you go to get further information? So as I mentioned already, there is a guidance document available on how to monitor ecosystem services, socioeconomic benefits, and resilience of food security, particularly in the context of Resilient Food Systems Project. But this information could also be much more broadly relevant as well. Another important resource I would point you towards is the guidelines for embedding resilience, adaptation, and transformation into sustainable development projects. This is a project that was developed at the request of the Jeff staff the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the GEF. So this is certainly a very important resource to look at, and I would also suggest that you look at this resource early in your project design, as it's important to start thinking about how to build resilience into projects as early in the design process as possible. Where can you actually get these resources? Well, these resources, and then also information on many of the other tools that I've mentioned, is available on the Resilient Food Systems website. So you'll see there it's at resilientfoodsystems.co. So I'd suggest you certainly visit that site because there's a lot of useful information there available on, of course, the projects themselves, but then also on the various tools that I've mentioned. So that concludes this training. As I mentioned, this is just the first in a series of trainings that we'll be preparing. The next training will focus in more detail on using some of the tools that I've mentioned, including the Resilience Atlas and Trends.earth. So I certainly suggest that you view those trainings because they have a lot of useful information in terms of how to assess resilience. And we will also be conducting a training on how to link with other regional platforms for building resilience. So I suggest that if you're interested in that topic, that you join that training as well. Thanks a lot.